In one maximum security prison in the U.S., the violence became so uncontrollable, the federal government intervened, and state officials quietly prepared to shut it down. What happens when a prison becomes a battlefield, and the system itself retreats? The walls that failed. Behind the razor wire, concrete walls and towering guard posts lies an institution that was meant to keep society safe, but instead became a place where brutality bred itself. In the heart of America, one correctional facility emerged as a symbol of breakdown. Guards overwhelmed, inmates brutalized, disorder spreading until the state and federal government both concluded, this prison must close or be radically changed. The story begins with the architecture. The building was designed for containment, control, logic, rows of cells, surveillance towers, strict routines. But design alone cannot restrain chaos. At this prison, call it Facility X for the moment, the systems meant to ensure safety were stretched, frayed, then snapped. In official reports, inmate-on-inmate assault soared, staff attrition spiked, and the daily operations resembled war zones more than correctional facilities. The government's own investigations reached the grim conclusion that the facility was dangerous beyond repair. On a typical shift, one guard might be responsible for dozens of men, many of them convicted of violent crimes, gang-affiliated, desperate. Overcrowding compounded the issue. Cells holding 2 men were packed with 4, 5, sometimes more. Dorms designed for 200 housed 300 within scrambled bunks. Ventilation failed, medical care lagged, and the air itself carried tension, fear, and the scent of violence. The very structure begun to echo the dysfunction. From tunnels, the clang of metal doors opening and slamming. From the yard, jaywalked fights, shanks found in bathrooms, screams muffled by concrete. The state, watching from the outside, saw increasing incident reports. Stabbings, murders, suicides, even guards killed. In internal audits, lines like staffing levels inadequate to provide basic supervision and weapons proliferation and inmate gang control unchecked appeared repeatedly. As one federal oversight memo put it, the prison had become a system unto itself, one where the rules of society do not apply. These words were not sensational. They were bureaucratic, delivered in dry language, but reflecting an emergency. At a hearing in the state capitol, legislators heard testimony of officers telling of shifts where they didn't know how many inmates were locked in each cell, where keys were lost or misused, where backup was minutes away, minutes too many. In one instance, an officer reported to supervisors that a dorm had become a fully functioning gang compound, while the official count of guards remained unchanged. Yet the budget for new posts, for training, for oversight, these did not keep pace. But what triggers a shutdown isn't simply bad headlines. It comes when the government, state or federal, decides that the risk is no longer tolerable, that the institution cannot be reformed in place, and that the only viable option is closure. In Facility X's case, that discussion began quietly, months before the press releases. Behind locked doors, officials met, directors of corrections, attorneys from the Department of Justice, budgeting officers. The cost of continued operation grew astronomical, not only financially, but morally. The facility was consuming lives. The decision pathway, liability made enormous, lawsuits looming, conditions so bad that courts began to threaten takeover. Staff morale collapsed. Attrition soared. Families of inmates threatened class actions. A once firm line, "This is our prison, our responsibility," began to wobble. For the men locked inside, the talk of closure was invisible. They still woke each morning in bunk rooms crammed with men, heard alarms in the night, felt the anxiety of survival. They didn't know the government might pull the plug. They only knew the violence. Yet this creeping decision shaped everything. The momentum of change or the specter of abandonment. Inside the storm, inmates, staff and survival. There's a saying whispered among correctional officers across the Deep South. Some prisons hold men. Others just survive them. This was one of the latter. Facility X was never meant to handle the storm it became. When you step inside, the first thing you notice isn't the smell or the sound, it's the temperature. The air feels heavier, like tension made tangible. Every movement, every sound, a door closing, a key rattling, a cough, carries weight. Because inside, everything is amplified. Danger, rumor, rage. This was Holman Correctional Facility, in Atmore, Alabama, once called the Slaughterhouse. Built in the 1960s as a maximum security facility, it was home to some of the most violent men in the state. Murderers, gang leaders, lifers with nothing left to lose. But over time, Holman became something else, a living symbol of the collapse of control. By 2016, federal data showed that Holman's staff-to-inmate ratio had fallen to one of the lowest in the country. Entire dorms, holding over 100 prisoners, were supervised by a single officer, sometimes none at all during shift gaps. One officer told the Montgomery Advertiser in an interview, "We're not running the prison anymore. The inmates are." It wasn't hyperbole. Inside, gangs had become governing bodies. They decided who could sleep where, who ate first, who lived, and who didn't. The tier captains, powerful inmates, mediated disputes and enforced discipline, often through brutal means. Weapons were currency. Metal scraped from vents, toothbrushes sharpened into spikes, bed frames repurposed as blades. Contraband flowed like water. Phones, drugs, tobacco. And behind every trade was violence. A former inmate described it simply: you either pay, fight, or die. Sometimes all three. The turning point. The 2016 riot. On March 11, 2016, Holman erupted. It started small, an argument over control of a cell block. But within minutes, it became a war zone. Inmates set fires, overran security doors, and seized multiple sections of the facility. One of the men involved later told reporters, "We wanted them to see it. We wanted them to feel what we feel every day, trapped, ignored, and ready to explode." During the riot, the warden and a correctional officer were stabbed. The fire burned through the night. Flames and black smoke billowed from the roof. The chaos was captured on contraband cell phones. The videos later leaked online, showing inmates with makeshift weapons, chanting, pacing, and declaring that Holman belongs to us now. 4 hours, there was no control. No guards inside, no order restored. Only at dawn did state troopers storm the building and reclaim it. But the damage was done. Holman had crossed a threshold. It had publicly proven that the state had lost control. When images of the riot reached national news, they shocked viewers but not those familiar with the system. The U.S. Department of Justice had already been investigating Alabama's prisons, citing rampant violence, chronic understaffing, and unconstitutional conditions. Holman became the case study, the visual proof of collapse. After the riot, something strange happened. Inmates celebrated. Not because they won, but because they were finally seen. 4 years, they'd written letters to reporters, activists, and the Equal Justice Initiative. Many of those letters described daily horrors. Men sleeping in showers because cells were full, stabbings so common they didn't even make reports, guards quitting mid-shift, and medical care delayed until death. One letter read, "They call it Holman Correctional, but ain't nothing corrected here. This place was built for pain." The guards sighed. While the public fixated on inmates, the guards themselves were breaking. Low pay, forced overtime, and trauma turned correctional officers into prisoners of their own system. Many were recruited from small rural towns nearby, with promises of stable work and benefits. What they got was chaos. A retired sergeant described it like this: "You walk in every day wondering if you'll walk out. Not from an inmate attack, but from your own nerves giving out." In the wake of the 2016 riot, turnover hit record levels. Officers were quitting mid-shift, some leaving their keys on the desk and walking away. The few who stayed faced impossible conditions, sometimes managing over 200 inmates alone. Several guards began forming alliances with certain inmates just to survive. These uneasy truces blurred the line between authority and complicity. Some smuggled contraband to keep the peace. Others looked away during beatings, knowing intervention could mean death. One guard told Vice News, "You learn real fast. This place don't follow prison rules. It follows jungle rules." Inside the code of survival. In Holman, survival meant understanding the code. Every inmate, whether old-timer or newcomer, learned it fast. Don't owe anyone. Don't snitch. Don't stare too long. And never, ever be alone at night. The hierarchy was brutal but efficient. Order existed, but it belonged to the prisoners, not the state. Those who resisted the gangs were marked. Violence wasn't random. It was communication. And behind each act was a message. This place belongs to us. Yet, amid the chaos, fragments of humanity persisted. Some inmates ran small libraries, others taught GED classes in secret, using stolen pencils and scraps of paper. A handful of officers still tried to help, bringing food from home for sick inmates. It was survival, not reform, but survival is still resistance. The unseen cost. By the end of 2017, Holman's reputation was cemented. The DOJ's ongoing investigation revealed that Alabama's prison homicide rate was nearly 8 times the national average. The data was staggering. More murders in a single year than in some entire state systems combined. And still, it continued. Because shutting down a prison doesn't erase the people inside, it only moves the problem elsewhere. By 2020, Alabama's governor announced that Holman would be partially closed due to deteriorating conditions and security failures. The state began planning new mega-prisons to replace it, but the violence didn't stop. It just migrated. Holman became a symbol, not of justice, but of surrender. A place so violent that even the government, the architects of its walls, couldn't control it. When a prison stops correcting and starts surviving, it ceases to be a prison at all. It becomes something else, a reflection of everything society has refused to fix. The federal takeover. When the DOJ steps in. By 2019, Holman was no longer a secret. The smoke from its riots had cleared, but the scars, both visible and bureaucratic, remained. In Washington, D.C., stacks of reports from federal monitors and civil rights attorneys painted an unflinching picture of a system in collapse. For the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, the evidence was undeniable. Under federal law, specifically, the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act, CRIPA, the government could investigate prisons if inmates were subjected to unconstitutional conditions. Holman, and Alabama's entire correctional system, had crossed that line long ago. The federal investigation begins. In 2016, federal investigators quietly began visiting Alabama's prisons, interviewing inmates, officers, and wardens. They took photographs of cell blocks, walls smeared with blood, broken locks on doors, improvised weapons hidden under bunks, and shower stalls that doubled as sleeping quarters. In 2019, the U.S. Department of Justice released its findings. The 56-page report was damning. It concluded that Alabama's prisons for men routinely violate the 8th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, the right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. The DOJ didn't mince words. The level of violence in Alabama's prisons is objectively intolerable. Inmates are subject to constant danger, excessive force, and death. Among the findings were stories almost too brutal to believe. Men stabbed to death within sight of guards who were too outnumbered to intervene. Prisoners beaten unconscious by other inmates, only to be found hours later, unresponsive. Sexual assaults so rampant that entire dorms became known as rape units. Inmates sleeping on floors coated in feces and blood because there were no available bunks. Federal agents cataloged more than 24 homicides in Alabama prisons in a single year, an unprecedented number in modern U.S. corrections. For context, some states reported 0. State response: denial, then desperation. When the DOJ report hit the public, Alabama's Department of Corrections responded with a statement that stunned observers. While we acknowledge challenges within our facilities, the department does not agree that it has violated inmates' constitutional rights. The words rang hollow. Everyone, from guards to lawmakers, knew the truth. Holman was collapsing. So were Donaldson, St. Clair, and Fountain Correctional. The crisis wasn't isolated, it was systemic. Behind the scenes, state officials scrambled. There were meetings about increasing officer pay, contracting private firms for new prisons, and even reopening old facilities. But money couldn't buy back control. And control was what Holman had lost long ago. Inside the DOJ briefings. In closed-door sessions, DOJ attorneys and federal monitors shared photographs that never reached the public. Prison walls scorched black from makeshift fires. Rows of body bags in a facility garage following a weekend of multiple murders. A dorm security camera showing one inmate brutally assaulted while dozens watched, and no officer appeared for 18 minutes. A veteran DOJ investigator, who had worked on cases in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Florida, reportedly said, "I've seen violent prisons before. But Alabama is different. This isn't neglect, it's abandonment." In the same briefing, data analysts mapped the frequency of assaults. The result resembled a heat map of war zones. Certain dorms saw more violent incidents in a month than some entire states in a year. The findings forced Washington's hand. The Justice Department issued what's known as a Notice of Findings letter, giving Alabama a choice. Negotiate a consent decree, essentially federal oversight to fix the prisons, or face a full-scale federal lawsuit. Alabama hesitated. Negotiations stalled. Meanwhile, the violence didn't stop, it got worse. The human rights emergency. By 2020, advocates were calling Alabama's prisons a human rights crisis. Organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC, and the Equal Justice Initiative, EJI, began documenting first-hand testimonies from inmates. "We live like animals. We clean blood every day. We see men die every week." Another, from a correctional nurse. "I have treated stab wounds so deep I could see bone. I have begged for more staff, more supplies, more safety. Nobody listens." The crisis caught the attention of international media. The BBC, Vice, and the New York Times all ran features on Holman and Alabama's decaying prison system. The UN even referenced the situation in a briefing on U.S. human rights conditions. Yet, inside Alabama, the political conversation turned defensive. State officials argued that closing Holman or other prisons would risk public safety, releasing dangerous men or overcrowding neighboring facilities even further. But the DOJ was done waiting. The federal lawsuit. In 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice officially filed a lawsuit against the state of Alabama and the Alabama Department of Corrections. The complaint outlined a pattern of systemic constitutional violations and demanded immediate reform. It was a rare move, one that placed Alabama's prison system among the most scrutinized in modern American history. The lawsuit described Holman and other facilities as deadly, unsanitary, and lawless. It detailed graphic incidents. An inmate stabbed more than a dozen times with a homemade knife. Another found hanged in a cell after repeated pleas for protective custody. Guards forced to deploy pepper spray daily just to clear dorms for roll call. Even then, violence continued to rise. A DOJ monitor testified before Congress. Alabama's prisons are on the edge of implosion. If these were schools or hospitals, they would have been shut down long ago. The breaking point. By 2021, the crisis reached new extremes. Within just 3 months, 8 inmates were murdered across Alabama's prisons. At Holman, another riot broke out, smaller than the one in 2016, but no less telling. It proved that the system, despite oversight and promises of reform, was still uncontrollable. In response, Governor Kay Ivey announced the construction of 2 massive new mega-prisons. The plan was controversial. Critics said it was simply building new walls for the same violence. Supporters called it a necessary reset. But as of today, the violence hasn't stopped. Narrator. Somber, reflective tone. When a government sues itself for human rights violations, it's not just a policy failure. It's a moral one. The DOJ didn't just uncover a broken system, it exposed a truth America rarely wants to face. That some prisons are too violent, too corrupt, too far gone to fix. And yet, men still wake up there every morning. Gods still clock in. And the cycle continues. The aftermath. What happens when the system breaks itself? When the government declares one of its own prisons too violent to control, you might expect swift justice, sweeping reform, accountability, change. But in Alabama, the story didn't end that way. It evolved, slowly, quietly, into something even more complicated. A new plan for an old problem. In 2021, Governor Kay Ivey stood at a podium, flanked by correctional officials, and announced what she called a historic solution. The state would spend over $1.3 billion building 2 massive mega-prisons in rural counties, designed to replace the crumbling, overcrowded facilities like Holman, St. Clair, and Donaldson. The message was clear: we're not giving up, we're starting over. But not everyone saw it that way. Civil rights attorneys, former inmates, and national watchdogs accused the state of repeating its oldest mistake, trying to build its way out of a moral crisis. Brian Stevenson, founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, called it bluntly: "You can't build your way out of a culture of violence. You have to change it." Holman wasn't just an old building, it was a symbol of decades of neglect, of indifference that had hardened into policy. The DOJ's lawsuit was still pending. Prisoners were still dying. And yet, the bulldozers were already rolling, clearing land for what officials promised would be modern, humane correctional facilities. Behind the rhetoric, though, was something darker, a quiet admission that the old system couldn't be fixed. It had to be buried. What the data still shows. In the years following the DOJ lawsuit, Alabama's prison homicide rate remained the highest in the nation. Between 2020 and 2024, at least 97 incarcerated men were killed inside state custody, a number that dwarfed even the worst years of the Holman era. Federal monitors continued to visit, filing update after update, each one echoing the same refrain. Conditions remain dangerous, staff levels inadequate, and oversight insufficient. Even as new prison construction continued, violence found new walls to live behind. Because the problem was never just the infrastructure. It was the culture, a cycle of understaffing, indifference, corruption, and desperation. The forgotten people. Inside the prisons that remained, life went on, or something like it. Inmates still wrote letters, still traded contraband, still dreamed of parole that rarely came. One prisoner, a man who had spent 27 years between Holman and Donaldson, wrote to a local journalist in 2023. "They say Holman's gone. But Holman's still here. It's in every cell that smells like death. It's in every man who gave up." Meanwhile, correctional officers kept leaving the job in record numbers. Recruiting campaigns advertised sign-on bonuses and career stability, but no paycheck could buy peace of mind. Many officers developed PTSD, anxiety, or substance abuse issues. One former sergeant told the Marshall Project, "You start as a guard, but you end up as a ghost. You walk out, but the place don't leave you." The same could be said for the inmates, and for Alabama itself. A state on trial. As the DOJ's lawsuit wound its way through federal court, Alabama became the face of America's prison reckoning. Other states watched nervously: Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, knowing their systems weren't far behind. The legal question was monumental. Could the federal government force a state to change the way it punishes, confines, and rehabilitates? The moral question was even bigger. At what point does incarceration become torture? During one hearing, a DOJ attorney addressed the court with words that echoed nationwide. "A system that cannot protect the people it confines is a system that has lost its right to operate." The courtroom fell silent. The statement was as much an accusation as it was a confession, a reflection of what had gone wrong not just in Alabama, but across the country. The ghost of Holman. Today, Holman still stands, partially operational, its death row unit still active. The old cell blocks, where fires once burned and riots raged, now sit dark and empty. The echoes of chaos still linger in the concrete. Locals drive past the facility and call it the ghost prison. To some, it's a stain on Alabama's history. To others, it's a warning, a lesson that brutality, when ignored, eventually turns inward. A former inmate, now free, returned to Holman's Perimeter Road one evening for an interview. As the sun dipped behind the razor wire, he looked through the fence and said, "I ain't mad they shut it down. I'm mad they waited until it was too late." Holman was more than a prison. It was a mirror, reflecting what happens when a system built on punishment forgets about humanity. The government didn't shut it down to protect the inmates, they shut it down to protect themselves. But what about the next one? The next Holman? The next headline? Fade to archival footage, black and white photos of the prison, the riots, the courtrooms, the guards walking off shift. If justice means anything, it must exist even for those society has forgotten. Because a prison that kills hope doesn't just destroy men behind bars, it poisons the world outside them. The question that remains: the government tried to shut it down. But can you ever really close a place like Holman? Or does it live on, in the next overcrowded cell, the next desperate letter, the next statistic we scroll past? Maybe the real story isn't that the government shut down a violent prison, but that it took them so long to admit it was violent at all.